So, good evening, everyone. Welcome to week 12 of administrative law. Here we are at the end of the term. I feel like it's um, hit us really quickly. It's it seems like we only just started, but here we are. Maybe it doesn't feel like for you guys. Maybe it feels like you've been slogging through admin law forever. But here we are. Lots and lots of things to cover today. We've got our week 12 content on remedies. So, we've been through judicial review. We've thought about, okay, um, what what are the different grounds of review? Is there a problem with the decision? But now, actually, what can we ask the court to do about it? We then have got some general revision of the unit as a whole, and how do we tie all these different elements together? And then also just, I suppose, some general tips and hints and strategies for the exam. So plenty to cover. I will start with the general exam housekeeping kind of things. So hopefully you've seen today, I've put on Moodle under the assessment tab where the exam is. I've put the exam invigilation instructions. It's a very detailed document, so I would recommend that you have a look at that before the exam. Basically, it just it breaks down the procedures around, what is an invigilated exam and how does it work, and things like that. I've also added my suggested preparation in terms of what are the things that you can be doing in the lead up to the exam to prepare. So getting your study notes together and things like that. Making sure that you have updated Zoom. So just like before the midterm assessment, try and log into Zoom the day before just to make sure that if there are any updates or anything lurking in the system, that's all taken care of, because you don't want to be stressing about that on the day. And then on the day itself, making sure that you are logging in at 8:45, so 15 minutes before the exam start, and that will enable the invigilators to do ID checks and get you settled and everything like that. And then you'll be able to take the exam commencing at 9 o'clock. So the way that it will work is that the exam document will go live in Moodle at 9 o'clock. So that will be there. If for whatever reason you're in the exam room and the invigilator doesn't show up, start the exam at 9 o'clock anyway. You can still get into Moodle, you can still access the exam, and then we'll sort out the ID checks and that sort of thing as you're logging out at the end. But my expectation is that there shouldn't be any issues with that. And so the standard way of doing things is that all the ID checks will happen from 8:45 to 9 o'clock. You can find in Moodle as well, there's a table so there'll be 3 Zoom rooms. So you just look in the table to work out which room you'll be. It's sorted by your what letter does your surname start with. So it's broken down that way. And then there's a handful of students with accessibility exams. You're in group 3. So I'll send emails tomorrow to those students just to make sure that they're clear that that's the room that they're in as well. In terms of the way that the exam will run itself, what you will need to do, need to have your camera on and your microphone on at all times, and that enables the invigilator to basically just see that you're not getting help and not talking to anyone else during the exam itself. It's an open book exam though, so you're more than welcome to be referring to your notes. You're more than welcome to be on the computer, looking at notes on the computer. You can even Google things. My recommendation is that you will be well prepared enough that you shouldn't really need to do that. But if something strikes your mind that you just want to confirm and clarify, you're more than able to do that. So microphone and camera on, but you can put your sound down. And so that way you're not hearing everyone else's noises, like they're typing and they're stressed out sighing and things like that. So the invigilator can hear you, but you won't be distracted by hearing anyone else. The exam goes for the 2.5 hours, so you finish at 11:30 Queensland time, and all submissions need to be made via Moodle by 11:30. Because it's an exam, there's no extensions. You can't submit late. You get an automatic 0. And also, if you are not logged into the Zoom room and the invigilator hasn't signed off that you're in the Zoom room, your exam can't be counted as marked either. So definitely making sure that you're attending those invigilation sessions. I think that broadly covers the mechanics of the exam itself. And then it covers a couple of questions I've been asked in terms of, can you look at, can you be Googling things and stuff during the exam? But are there any other questions about those sort of really nuts and bolts logistics of the exam itself? No? Excellent. For the ID checks, ideally, you will have your student ID sorted by now and you will use your student ID. If for whatever reason that hasn't happened, really what we're doing is we're checking that you are who you say you are. And so like a driver's license, some other form of photo ID, that will be fine. That'll be workable. But it's you will save yourself any headaches with the invigilators by using a student ID if you've got one. So yeah, that's the logistics of it all. Let's move on to talking about remedies, our week 12 topic, and then we'll circle back to exam preparation and exam tips. So remedies is reasonably straightforward as a topic. And in some ways that's good. That makes it nice and simple. But I do find that the simplicity traps a lot of people in the sense that often answers. So we've said before, question 3 on the exam, it's worth 10 marks. It's going to be what remedies might be available. And often people cause themselves to miss out on marks because they don't give a very detailed answer to question 3. Part of that might just be time. You just run out of time in the exam, and we'll talk more about timing strategies later. But so part of that might be just a timing thing. People don't give themselves enough time to give a detailed answer. But the other thing is that you'll have probably gleaned from the lecture material, the court's role in giving remedies is very limited, right? Because the court is conscious of not overstepping its role into the executive. They can't make a new decision. They can't substitute a decision like the AAT can. And so what that means is that we're really, really quite limited to, in most cases, the court either setting the decision aside and then that's it, or setting the decision aside and asking the decision maker to, sending it back to the decision maker to make a new decision. And invariably that's kind of it. And so in itself, there's not a lot to say. And in an exam scenario, that sort of doesn't leave you a whole lot to discuss. What that means is a couple of things. The first is you need to make sure that you're thinking very carefully that within that limited section of selection of things that you're asking for, you are asking for the right things. And it's a pretty good guess that you will be asking to have a decision set aside. That's just sort of the nature of the scenario. But think very carefully about whether you want the decision sent back to the original decision maker. And the distinction being, if you've got, say it's an application, right? Your hypothetical client has asked for something and they've been told no. So for example, in our the midterm task, we had the client who was asking for the housing scheme application and she got told no. If we have the decision set aside, the client is not really any better off because they're still, sorry, did I freeze then? All righty. When did you lose me? Was it a long stretch? Judging by the grins, that might have been a long one.
Yeah.
Sorry, I saw you talking in, but your microphone was off. Beginning of the example. Okay, that's not too bad.
Yeah, on purpose.
So the be careful what you're asking for. So the example from the midterm scenario, we had the client who was asking for the housing affordability scheme. So asking for something and getting told no. If you just ask to have the decision set aside, the client's not really any better off, right? They're still not getting it. And while the court can't substitute its own decision and grant it, what they can at least do is send the decision back to the original decision maker in the hopes that they will, do things differently, do things properly, and will get it that time. So that might be a scenario where you want to set aside the original decision and send it back to the original decision maker for a new decision. But if you were in a scenario where a decision maker was, sort of took a more interventionist approach, or it kind of came out the blue. So, for example, thinking about the scenarios in some of the tutorials with the gaming and casino license, where we had the officers coming in and imposing a penalty and asking for the people to lose their employment. If we ask, that's something that Poe doesn't want. If we ask the court to set that decision aside, we get back to the status quo, and that's really where we want to be anyway. And so that's enough. If we ask for the decision to be sent back to the decision maker, that's just inviting them to impose another penalty or come up with something else instead. And so be really careful and just take that minute to stop and think, what's the end goal? Is the status quo enough in terms of setting the decision aside, or do you need something more? And just be really careful. I think sometimes people just kind of, often just copy and paste large sections of Section 16, which I would also strongly advise against doing. But just uncritically set the decision aside, send it back to the original decision maker. And if you actually stop and think and go, okay, well, actually, we don't really want this back in the decision maker's hands if we can help it. So just be very careful about what you're asking for. The second thing that, sort of in the context of the assessment and the limited scope for Section 16, that you should think about is the reasons why the court might refuse relief. So thinking about ideas like where relief might be futile, or there's some sort of problematic conduct on the part of the applicant. So undue delay, attempting to gain a business advantage, things like that. These are potential issues where there is a bit more of an opportunity to have a discussion and to add some more opportunity to showcase your knowledge and understanding of remedies and the court's role in granting remedies. So thinking about, look, this question is worth 10 marks. How is there going to be 10 marks worth of stuff in the question? You might well think, are there some reasons why the court might consider that they should refuse relief? And if that's the case, what are the reasons that you can provide to rebut that? So, the court might think that relief might be futile. What can you say to convince them that granting relief in this instance wouldn't be futile and they should grant the remedy anyway? So thinking about that as a potential avenue for including more of a discussion other than just Section 16A, set the decision aside and leaving it at that. And then the third thing to think about is the role of interlocutory application. So, for example, an injunction to at least put an immediate pause on enforcement of the decision until things can be sorted out. Your exam scenario is set up in a way where kind of the urgency of the exam timing makes sense. And so within that context, thinking about interlocutory injunctions and the kind of the more urgent ability of that form of relief might be something that you also think about. And so when you start to layer on top, okay, what can we do immediately via interlocutory application? What's the end goal in terms of Section 16 setting the decision aside and leaving it at that, or sending it back to the original decision maker? And then on top of that, look, maybe there's a reason why the court might think that it should refuse relief, and here's why we'll tell them that's not a great idea. Stacking on top of each other, you then end up with a couple of paragraphs worth of stuff, and you get closer to something that's worth 10 marks on the exam. So the key thing, just really practically from an assessment perspective, the key thing that I want you to take away is to not sell yourself short on question 3. There's more to it than a copy paste of Section 16, and so yeah, don't lose out on those marks by not giving yourself enough time and not giving yourself enough consideration of those issues. Any questions? That was that was remedies in 10-15 minutes. Any questions about remedies that anyone wanted to really cover?
I had a question for the common law remedies. It seems they're pretty well replicated in Section 16. Would you bother to discuss the ins and outs of those, or just go straight to the Section 16 reference?
Yep, I would go. So it's a great question. What section, in the same way that the Administrative Decisions Judicial Review Act, Section 5, effectively codifies a lot of the grounds of review that were developed in the common law, Section 16 codifies the remedies that come through the common law system as well. And so effectively the way that breaks down then is if you are sort of seeking review under the Administrative Decisions Judicial Review Act, if you're talking about those Section 5 grounds of reviews, the appropriate remedy if you start in the statutory avenue, you stay in the statutory avenue. And so you talk, if you're saying that the Act applies, then stick to Section 16. If for whatever reason the Act didn't apply, so, for example, we've talked in week 5 about privative clauses and some of the other schedule exclusions under the Act. If for whatever reason the Act didn't apply and therefore you were relying on common law avenues for review, then you would also equally rely on the common law remedies. And so, yeah, keep them separate. Given that we have spent so much of this term talking about the Act and talking about scenarios where the Act does apply, I would suggest that it's a very safe bet that the Act will apply in the exam, and therefore you'll be thinking about Section 16 remedies. But for your own reference and knowledge, yeah, just recognizing that the grounds of review parallel between statute and common law, and the remedies parallel as well, but there's no need to refer to both sets of remedies. Any other questions? No, excellent. It's, yeah, for the most part, the remedies are pretty straightforward. And it's just a matter of making sure that you don't let that straightforwardness trick you into not giving a comprehensive enough answer on the exam. Speaking of the exam, let's talk a bit more in terms of revision and working out how best to prepare in the next 6 days. So we've talked before about, that there's 3 questions. Question 1, worth 11 marks. Is judicial review available? Question 2, what grounds of review might be relevant? Pick 3 and discuss those. That's worth 24 marks, so 8 marks per ground of review, and then 10 marks for what remedies might be available, and then a final 5 marks for structure and style and things like that. What I would suggest that you do is use that structure of questioning and use that marking breakdown to help guide your time management for the exam, and give yourself a budget of time for each question and really try and stick to that if you can. As I said before, often I see question 3 being quite short, and I think that oftentimes that's because people don't give themselves enough time to answer question 3. They get to the final 5 minutes of the exam or something, and it just becomes a mad rush to just copy and paste section 16 into the answer and hope for the best. So give yourself a budget and try and stick to it as much as possible. You will get more marks giving a pretty good answer to each question rather than spending all your time on question 1 and developing a perfect answer to question 1 and then not giving yourself enough time on the other 2 questions. So budget the time. Obviously, given that question 2 is worth the most marks, the most effective use of your time is to budget more time for question 2 than the other 2. But even within that, if you can break down, split whatever time you're allocating for question 2 equally 3 ways for each of the 3 grounds of review that you might discuss, that at least sets you up for maximum efficiency in terms of the marks that you can generate. In terms of some of the overall structural elements, there's a sort of a soft word limit of around 2,200 words. That's mostly just because I have to put a word limit down. Otherwise, technically, you could just copy and paste all your notes into the answer, and you would at least technically have the right rules, and so you'd get good marks on that. You might not get great marks at anything else, but you would at least have technically all the stuff there that you need to reference. So I do have to have a word count. It's 2,200 words. I don't expect you would necessarily need to use all of that. You could do well on the exam with an answer of around 2,000 words. If your answer's coming in at like 1,000 words, I would be worried that you've missed things. So definitely make sure that your answer is, up around, at least 1,800 words, I'd say. But bear in mind as well, we've talked about developing those exam scripts. And so you could have, 800 words at least of the exam written before you even go in there. So, in theory, it sounds like a lot, but it's when you actually sit down and do it, it's not necessarily, coming up with 2,000 fresh words on the spot. You're referencing, you do need to reference work that's not your own. And so, where you're referring to the Act, where you're referring to particular cases, that does need to be footnoted. It doesn't necessarily need to be perfect AGLC, and that's just a concession to the time limit of the exam, right? I'm not going to stress over, have you got the exact pinpoint reference right, or, worrying about IBIDs and above N5s and all that sort of stuff. Those details are less important on the exam, but it is important when you're referring to key cases and ideas that are not your own, that there is a reference associated that as a matter of academic integrity. Bear in mind as well, though, that because you're preparing your notes beforehand and because you can be copying and pasting stuff from your notes into the exam document, often there's no reason why you couldn't have your referencing in good standard anyway. But you know, in terms of perfect compliance with AGLC, that's not high on the priority list. That's probably it in terms of the, I suppose, more structural ideas about what to think about and what to prepare for. The only other thing, the scenario we've talked before about, it'll be similar to the midterm task in terms of it's one scenario and the three questions arise from that. You will get a reason for decision letter. You will get a little bit of evidence that comes along with it, and you'll get a hypothetical statute. The scenario itself is a follow on from the midterm task. So it's sort of, we left off Sasha's journey with the AAT review. Now the exam picks up with, okay, we got the decision at the AAT review and what's happened to her in the month or so since. So if you want to prepare, you might want to familiarize yourself a little bit with the midterm scenario again. You don't have to, and it's very, very possible to do, everything you need on the exam is, you've got everything you need within the exam document, and you don't necessarily need to refer to the midterm task at all. But if there was something that you felt was relevant from the midterm task that you wanted to loop back in this time around, you'd be welcome to do that as well. So if you want to refresh your mind of the midterm task, you can do that too. But you don't necessarily have to. So that's it structurally, I suppose. The next topic that I've really got to talk about is a bit more revision and how we bring these ideas together. But are there any sort of structural questions or anything that anyone wanted to cover before we move on to that?
I know this might be a hard question to answer. I don't know, but just with the word limit, is there a word limit that you'll stop reading at? Or do you know what if I have, if we get to the end of the exam and we've got like 4,000 words or something, would you suggest trying to cull that back? Like, will you stop reading?
I would definitely avoid submitting anything that is too long. We don't stop reading, but it's a 10% penalty per 100 or part of 100 words over the word limit. So if you had 4,000, I think you'd probably end up having your mark reduced to
Oh, yes.
zero by that point.
Very counterproductive.
But and so that's the thing, right? Is like you've got this incredible benefit in terms of being able to copy and paste portions of your notes into the exam document, right? And that's, from a time perspective, that's incredible. And so the counter to that needs to be, there does need to be a word limit to just stop. You could just dump everything in there and just take a scattergun approach and hope for the best. The 2,200 word limit is high in the sense that I don't expect that you would fully need that. It's very, very possible to have a good answer that covers everything that you need to in the 1,800 to 2,000 word mark. If you were, sort of coming at like 2,300 or something, that's not going to cause alarm bells. But if it's just pages and pages and pages, it would say to me that there's just been a scattergun approach. There's just been dumping of huge sections of stuff that don't need to be there. The exam scenario itself doesn't contain enough stuff in there that you could usefully spend 4,000 words on it. So yeah, it's the word limit is there to just stop, basically to sort of save you from yourself, rather than necessarily wanting to stop you from saying things that you need to say. The other thing to keep in mind is because you only need to talk about 3 grounds of review, that really cuts down the things that you need to talk about too. Where in previous years, where the time limit was longer, the word limit was higher too, because you could talk about as many grounds of review as you thought were relevant, and that could get up to the 5 or 6 or sometimes even 7 mark. But because it's just the 3, that really narrows your focus too. And I find that, yeah, the word limit is not an issue because of that.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. And just one more thing on the word limit. Are footnotes included?
Let me triple check for you.
Okay, thank you.
No. As long as they're just referencing, so footnotes that include substantive material count, but as long as they're just referencing, they don't count. Looking at it again as well, so there's a 10% allowance on the word count as well, so that technically puts you up at what, 2,420 or something words. So yeah, you've got more than enough words to get everything done in.
Thank you.
That's all good. Any other structural things that people wanted to ask or talk about? No, that's all good. Well, so let's then think about how do we tie all of this together, and how do we think about providing a comprehensive exam answer that brings together all these ideas that we've been talking about in the unit as a whole. So I think the key thing to think about in relation to question 1, we've been talking about it week in, week out, is really making sure that you're narrowing down and focusing on these key issues of justiciability, jurisprudence, and standing, and making sure that you are still giving enough detail and consideration to each subpoint within that. Because we do this week in, week out, and really try and drill in, because these are such important fundamental questions, or threshold questions. And because it's a very safe bet that judicial review will be available, right? Because if it's not, the whole exam falls apart. But don't let that let you fall into the trap of just glossing over it because it's probably going to be available. Make sure you're still stepping through the different elements. And so something like standing is a really good example of that. Don't just sort of say, oh, well, such and such has an interest in this case, their interests have been affected, therefore they would have standing. It's great that you can identify that, but that won't get you anywhere near as many marks as if you step through, okay, in order to access judicial review, the applicant has to have standing. That means that they have to have an interest that goes beyond that of the ordinary member of the public. It needs to be more than a merely intellectual or emotional concern. Maybe reference ACF and Commonwealth as authority for that. Then point to the particular interest or whatever it is that has been impacted that you think would give them more than a merely intellectual or emotional concern. And then think about, we talked about different categories or types of interests that the courts have been more than willing to recognize as being more than merely intellectual or emotional. So things like material interests or commercial interests being affected, issues around, is indigeneity a special interest? These sorts of ideas tie all that discussion in as well. And so, potentially on this one issue of standing, you've got the I'm stressed and I'm frantically trying to race through this exam in the mad hope that I've got time to do everything as possible. I'm just going to quickly say, yeah, they've got standing, move on. Or there's, I've prepared, I've done a script that goes through a lot of the key points and authorities, and then I just have to fill in the gaps. And then you've got a really comprehensive and thorough answer that goes through all of the issues. Same with justiciability. Within that, we've got all these sub themes around, was a decision made? What is it? What is a decision? How do we know that? Is it of administrative character? What does that mean? How do we know that? Breaking down, there are marks associated with each of these little sub elements that we've been talking about week in, week out. Make sure your answer provides, detail on each of those so that you can get the marks that are associated with each of those. So just being really careful and really thorough. If you are well prepared, that question 1 can be a really good source of relatively easy marks for you, because it is really heavily weighted towards a lot of that sort of formulaic questions around, what is a decision and things like that. So that's a question where a lot of preparation will really pay off for you. And because you know so much of what is coming in question 1. So definitely put the time in for that. Definitely put the time in for all of it, but definitely put the time in for question 1. Question 2, thinking about the different grounds of review. Obviously, the ideal position to be in by next week is to have a really good understanding of all the different grounds of review, all the different types of issues that might arise, different cases that are relevant, and all that sort of thing. But the things that you can do to really make sure that you are making an effective use of your time is practicing identifying which grounds of review might be in play. We've talked last week about, you only need to talk about 3, but definitely don't sell yourself short by only studying 3 and hoping that they come up. Make sure that you are across the different issues and across multiple grounds of review, but also think about how different grounds of review cluster together, and identify how, where you've identified that one particular ground of review is relevant, does that clue you onto other grounds of review potentially being relevant as well? So, we've talked about no evidence or making a decision in the absence of evidence is itself a ground of review, but that might also point you to unreasonableness, because a reasonable decision maker is making decisions based on evidence. And so if you're identifying no evidence, then immediately thinking, okay, well, maybe unreasonableness is popping up as well. Thinking about, for example, where a decision maker has failed to follow procedures. So the decision's unauthorized because a procedure wasn't followed, and it's the clear intention of Parliament that failing to follow that procedure should invalidate the decision. If the procedure is something that aims to provide natural justice to the decision maker, to the person affected, then failing to follow that procedure might also have meant that the person was denied natural justice. And so thinking about those as being two grounds of review that potentially fit together. Relevant and irrelevant considerations we've talked about, can sometimes be two sides of the same coin. They don't always exactly go together, but thinking about how these are two grounds of review as well, where if you've got one issue, you should be on the lookout, at least in the scenario, for whether you've got the other one as well. So just thinking about the way that these different grounds of review are pairing together is really important, and part of the goal in your revision should be get the basics right for each of them, and then as a next step think about the connections and the ideas that help clue you onto where multiple ones are potentially in play. And what that does in an exam scenario, it gives you a little shortcut, because if you can identify one, potentially you actually end up identifying all three that you're going to talk about on the exam. But it also helps you, I suppose, solidify your understanding of the content, because in identifying the connections between them, you're actually embedding these ideas around, okay, well, why is this a ground of review? Why does this capture a particular problem with the decision-making process? And then, what are the other grounds of review that also attach to these sort of core underpinning problems with the decision-making? So it's as a study tool, it's pragmatically, it's a really good one, because it's a bit of a cheat code for the exam, but it's also a really good one because it really just solidifies your understanding. So for question 2, get the basics down for each, and then build up to identifying the connections between each. As a third step, we'll talk about the practice exam after, but the third step is putting that understanding to play in the practice exam. And then for question 3, as I've said before, really focusing on giving a comprehensive answer and giving an answer that is, I suppose, meaty enough to be worth 10 marks, rather than just falling into the trap of section 16(1)(a), set the decision aside, leave it at that. Please do not copy and paste section 16(1) just as a block. More than anything else, I think on an exam, I just get 16(1)(a) copied and pasted and put in as the answer to question 3. So please don't let that be you. Please put some thought and consideration and analysis into the answer, and make sure you're giving yourself enough time to do that within the exam. And as I said, think about what you're asking for. If you want the status quo, just ask to have the decision set aside. Don't waste your time and your client's time asking to have the decision sent back to the decision maker if you don't need to. Conversely, if you do need to, include that and include a little bit of a discussion about why that's the limit, as opposed to asking for a new decision from the court, because of course they can't provide that. It goes beyond the scope of judicial review. So that's the 3 questions. That's where I suppose your study should be aiming towards. I think hopefully in previous weeks I've talked about a good strategy, or something that I would suggest, is having kind of a detailed set of notes and a condensed set of notes. So aim to have a set of notes that is really comprehensive and that's got your basically everything you need in order to double check anything that you need for the exam. So details of cases, details of key principles, all those explanations and things like that. Your exam scripts that we've talked about. But then what I would suggest is often really effective is to have a second shorter set of notes, and that would be 1 or 2 pages, and that's just a real headline, maybe more of a checklist. And the idea is that as you're first reading through the exam scenario, use that really short set of notes to help just guide your thinking. And so what you might like to do is have that set of notes printed out if you can, and just go through and circle, the 3 grounds of review that you think really leap out to you as being relevant, or just, have for question 1 all the different elements and just quickly jot down some notes about, okay, so I know I need to talk about standing. Here's the interests that seem to have been affected. And use that really short set of notes to help plan your answer. And then as you're writing, then you can use the detailed set of notes to check something. I know it was Kiora and West was important, but who was the judge that had a great quote in that? Go into your detailed notes. But using that will just be, I suppose, a really effective way. You don't want to be, if you can help it, wasting time in the exam scrolling through pages and pages of your notes, trying to find some core idea or key case or something like that. If you can have a short set of notes that really guides you through each of those, that's a really great way of approaching that. So, and everyone's different. The ultimate thing is to aim to get notes that work for you, but often I find that's generally something that's really useful to aim for. Final point, practice exam. I've put a practice exam question up. It's from a few years ago where the time limit was longer, the scope was longer in terms of you could talk about more grounds of review, things like that. I've kept that as the practice exam question on the basis that it's more complicated or more detailed than the thing that you will have to do in the exam. So if you can do the practice exam, you'll be fine for the real event. So I think it's better to practice on something harder, and then by comparison, the real thing will seem easier. So that's there. My suggestion would be that you save that until kind of the end of your study and revision. And the main reason for that is you can use that as a practice run for your notes. So, have the notes, the set of notes that you've developed with you as you do the practice exam. And that will help you identify, are your notes comprehensive enough for what you will need? But it also gives you practice actually flicking through your notes and finding things that you need under a time pressure. So, if you give yourself the 2.5 hours to do the practice exam and do a full practice run like that, it will actually help you realize not only do my notes contain everything they need to contain, but are they laid out in a way that's easy enough to navigate that I can do it under a quick time constraint, or do I need a better system? Do I need to color code things or whatever it is? But give them that test run. It can be a really effective study strategy as well. That's sort of it for my general exam advice. And I suppose the steps between now and next week in terms of preparation. Any final questions or any clarification on, I suppose, that side of things?
Jacob, I just wanted to circle back to the logistics topic. So for the exam, it's one that we need to allocate time to submit in Moodle, or is it one that automatically submits for us?
Yeah, no, so you will need to give yourself time to get into Moodle and upload the exam document. So, if you give yourself, to be safe, I'd say 5 minutes at the end of the exam, just to make sure that you've got all of that ready to go. As with Zoom, I would suggest get into Moodle the day before or the day of as well, just to check that all of that is working. I think that Zoom and Moodle and those systems always find the most inopportune moments to ask you to update or ask you to change your password or things like that. So just making sure that all of those kind of tech things are as laid out as possible, so that it's as smooth as possible. What you can do is have your exam document. So, create a Word document and save it with the file name, your surname, administrative law take home exam or whatever. It's the briefest thing. It only takes you a minute to do. But you'd rather spend that minute the night before rather than in the stress of frantically trying to upload in the last 2 minutes of the exam. But yeah, in terms of developing a time budget, that's a great thing, is to just make sure that you give yourself 5 minutes at the end to upload and make sure that it's submitted and things like that. It's a good point.
Thank you.
Any other questions or comments? No, well, there we go. It was I know I did a lot of talking in that that tutorial, but I guess there's a lot to convey. I'll just double check my notes to make sure that I've covered everything that I wanted you to know, given you all the hints that I wanted to give you. So we talked last week as well about, the exam invites you to talk about relevant grounds of review, and that might not necessarily mean 3 home run, absolutely these 3 grounds of review will apply and you'll win. I think I might have frozen there though, so I'll just hold on a minute. Alrighty, I think my computer didn't handle me looking at the notes then. So we talked last week about the exam. In terms of the grounds of review that you might discuss, the exam invites you to talk about 3 grounds of review that are relevant and comment on their likelihood of success. That doesn't necessarily mean that you need to come up with 3 home run absolute winner 3 grounds of review. It might be that you pick 2 that are really good and are really solid arguments, and the third one is one that might apply if certain facts are interpreted in the way that support our argument, or you might identify a third one that seems relevant, but it's not likely to be successful for a particular reason, or because there's a particular issue or something like that. So really focusing in on relevant doesn't have to mean successful, but in presenting your argument and your critical analysis in particular, being able to showcase a good understanding of the law in this space includes being able to comment on the reasons why this might be a strong argument, or this ground of review would be likely to succeed, versus, here are the reasons why this ground of review might be unlikely to succeed, or why there might be particular issues or counter arguments or things like that. So just sort of allowing yourself the room to include that nuance and that discussion in the exam as well. You know, the application of the law to the facts is the single largest criteria, or it's proportionately worth the most. So making sure that you give yourself every opportunity to score good marks on that criterion is always advisable. The other thing to think about, or I suppose reiterate, is bringing in these ideas that we've been talking about throughout the term around the court's role in judicial review and communicating your understanding of that role. So we've talked about, you know, where the line is drawn around particular grounds of review. We can ask the court to say that the decision maker failed to consider a relevant consideration, but we can't ask the court to dictate how much weight should have been given to that consideration. These kinds of boundaries and these kinds of limitations are good opportunities for you to showcase your knowledge and understanding as well. So, you know, I know these are points that I've talked about before, so I won't harp out on about them any longer, but just reiterating that those are important opportunities for you to show off your understanding as well. But other than that, you know, that's sort of all I've got to say, other than this is very much an exam that benefits from preparation, and you know, I can only recommend that you spend the time preparing yourself as much as possible, because that preparation pays off in making the exam an easier and less stressful experience. The reality is that you will not have time to look things up. Sure, you can consult your notes and double check things and confirm things, but this is not an exam that you can afford to learn new things or figure it out on the day. Just because you've got access to your notes and access to the whole wonderful internet, don't just assume that, oh, well, if I need to know it, I'll look it up and I'll figure it out during the exam. I really have to stress, you will run out of time and the exam will be a really stressful experience. If you're prepared, if you have, you know, taken on board the lessons and the great reflections that you've had from the midterm assessment around being prepared and integrating your knowledge and your understanding of administrative law, then yeah, there's no reason why this exam has to be particularly stressful or scary. You know what's coming. It's just a matter of putting your knowledge into practice and yeah, just enjoying the 2.5 hour roller coaster that it is. With that, any final questions or comments before we wrap up? No, well, that's all good. Well, we leave it there. It just remains for me to say thank you all for your effort and your commitment to your studies this term. As I said at the beginning, you know, administrative law is not for everyone. It's a tricky subject, but you're all here. You've all made it to through these 12 weeks. Thank you especially to those of you who are here in the tutorial today and who have shown up week after week. We've had some really great discussions, and particularly grateful. I think that this is a term where in particular there's been a lot of different perspectives and different takes on the exam scenarios that I often haven't heard before. So that's really great to see, and I do want to acknowledge and commend the creativity, I suppose, that a lot of you are bringing to administrative law and these questions. So that's always really great to see. That's really encouraging. And so yeah, thank you all for your commitment to your studies, and best wishes for the exam. and to the rest of your studies here at CQU. So thank you all very much, and yeah, all the
Thank you.
best.
Thank you, Jake.
Thanks,
Thank
Jake.
you.
Thank you, mate.